Yeah. No, tell the president I can't play basketball with him today. I've got to do work. Okay. All right, thanks. Sorry about that. Hi. This is Module 3, Lecture 8 for the course Introduction to International Relations. And in this lecture, we're going to be talking about Alexander Wendt's article, Anarchy is What States Make of It. So, Wendt goes out to explain the origins of state interests and behavior. And he says that state behavior could be looked at in a couple of different ways. It could be the result of structure, which, as we learned in previous lectures, relates to the condition of anarchy in the international system and the polarity or the number of powers that exist in the international system. Or it could be a function of process. And by that he means the interaction and learning that takes place between countries and how that colors their decisions about how to act toward one another. So also to look at how state interests are derived from a couple of different perspectives. Both neoliberals and neorealists view state interests as given. There's something that we already know, right? States engage in rational behavior in pursuit of their self-interests. Or if you're a constructivist, you think of state interests as being created through interactions. So how states treat one another will have an effect on the kinds of interests that they decide to pursue. But where do these interests come from in the first place, regardless of whether we're taking this from a neoliberal, neorealist, or constructivist standpoint? Well, Alexander Wendt famously argues that anarchy is what states make of it. So he takes on this issue from a constructivist standpoint, and he says that people act toward objects, including other actors, on the basis of the meanings that those objects have for them. As we saw from the previous lecture when we discussed constructivism, when we looked at the $100 bill, the meaning and the way in which you can interact with that money and the way that other people react when they're receiving it, that affects the meaning that is embodied within it. And similarly, states act differently toward their enemies than they do toward their friends. So just by observing those kinds of interactions, we can learn a lot about the meaning that those relationships have and how they affect the relations between states that have an animus toward one another or that are amiable toward one another. And collective meanings constitute these structures which influence our behavior. So perhaps under the constructivist argument, it's postulated that structures are not the polarity of the international system or the condition of anarchy, but the meanings that we derive from our shared experiences. And these are the things which actually influence our behavior. Whereas simply by looking at the structure of the international system in terms of the distribution of power and the situation of anarchy or absence of a central authority in the international system, that doesn't tell us who's who's going to be friends with whom, right? And a classic example of this might be if you're looking at, the United States and its ally, the State of Israel, versus, say, Iran. So the United States is friends with Israel and has kind of a more complex relationship, certainly not an overtly positive one, with Iran. And yet both Iran and Israel have the capability to develop a nuclear arsenal. Israel allegedly has one. The United States has worked concertedly with other countries to prevent Iran from having one. So how is it that the United States views one country as a friend and one country as a potential enemy that they should try and thwart toward their pursuit of gaining access to nuclear weapons? So just knowing the structure doesn't tell us that, but knowing the historical relationships between the United States and Israel and the United States and Iran tells us a lot more than their material capabilities. So identities, getting back to the identity principle that we've talked about, right? We have those three principles: the principle of dominance, principle of reciprocity, and the principle of identity. And identities, Wendt argues, are the basis of our interests. So I have a personal exercise. So if you'll indulge me for a few moments, I think you might find this really interesting. So what I want you to do is write down 20 different aspects of your identity. So take out a sheet of paper, write down 20 different ways in which you would identify yourself. Or another way to think about this is 20 ways in which a friend might identify you. What are 20 things that kind of stand out, that make you an individual, make you a unique person? So you can pause this, take a couple minutes to do that, and then we will do another aspect of this exercise, which will give you additional information about why this is useful for understanding the constructivist viewpoint on the origins of state behavior. Okay, so now I want you to look at, of those 20 things that you have identified as part of your identity, which of these would you consider to be roles? And by that I mean basically something that is functional or relational about yourself. So it could be that you're a brother or a sister or a husband or a wife or a cousin or a best friend. It could be the functional positions in which you are active on a daily basis. You could be a worker, you could be a leader of a student organization, you could be a supervisor at your job. These are roles that have some kind of defined capabilities and aspects of what they are designed to do, which allow you to operate within those norms when you are kind of embodying that particular role. And you may shift between roles, right? You may have a situation where who you are with your family is very different than who you are at work. So when you're with your family, maybe you are the youngest of 3 children. But maybe at work, you're a supervisor overseeing 3 people. And so the ways that you interact with people will be very different depending on the context. So this is all a way of saying that if you know what your roles are, that helps you to figure out the complexity that is involved in your overall identity. So an example of this can be seen in security systems, different kinds of security systems. And I'm not talking about the ones on your house, but we're talking about at the international level. So in a competitive security system, states identify negatively with each other's security. This is kind of like the security dilemma, right? Collective action is nearly impossible because everyone views every other state's actions in pursuit of its own security as a threat to their own security. So here it's very difficult for states to work together because they are constantly viewing the actions of each other skeptically, and it makes it difficult to cultivate trust in one another. Another kind of security system is known as an individualistic security system. And here it's where states are indifferent to the relationship between their own and another's security. So here collective action is at least possible, but in general there's not this degree of identification with the other state. So it's possible that collective action emerges to provide security, but at the same time there's not a whole lot to go on that will spur it into action. And then finally, a third kind of security system is known as a cooperative security system. And this is a situation in which states identify positively with one another so that the security of each is perceived as the responsibility of all. And this is where you really feel compelled to support the other states. You identify with them strongly, probably because of some kind of history or kinship or mutual purpose or values. And here, collective action is something that's practiced regularly because everyone in the system wants to protect each other because they feel so intimately tied toward one another. You might think of a cooperative security system as kind of like a family, where the family is seeking to protect itself at all costs, and they definitely care about the well-being of each individual member of the family. Okay, so a little bit more of a fun way of looking at this can be seen in initial interactions with alien species through science fiction. So I'm going to show you a couple of very short videos, and you're going to see that there's a striking difference in the way that the actors respond to an alien presence the first time that they interact with it. And so the basis of that interaction may be about a result of our preconceived notions, or in the latter case, what the alien itself does. And then humans react to that because they now have some basis for assessing whether an alien presents a threat or not. So let's watch these 2 videos, and then we will kind of recap what we've learned.
Be a victim.
Mike, come here.
How you feeling, Faker?
I'm feeling fine. Look, I've got something really important to
said
tell
he
you.
got 69,000 on asteroids yesterday, but he pulled the plug.
Look, remember the goblin?
You're so lame, Elliot.
Come on, Michael, he came back.
Came back? He came back? Oh, my God!
One thing. I have absolute power. Say it. Say it.
What have you got? Is it the coyote?
No. Look. Okay. Now, swear it. The most excellent promise you can make. Swear as my only brother on our lives.
Don't get so heavy, I swear.
Okay, stand over there, and, you'd better take off your shoulder
What?
pads. You might scare him. And, close your eyes.
Don't push it, Elliot.
I'm not coming out there until your eyes are closed.
Okay, they're closed. I'm just gonna kill you.
Okay, swear it one more time. I have absolute...
You have absolute power. Yes.
Elliot, look what I made for you.
Welcome back. So what we see in these two different examples are two different ways of responding to stimuli when there's no basis for any kind of prior interaction. In the first case of E.T., the extraterrestrial from the 1980s, you saw that Gertie, who's actually played by Drew Barrymore, for those of you keeping track, is absolutely terrified because she has no prior experience interacting with anything quite like E.T., and so she very understandably runs away screaming bloody murder, right? In the other example from War of the Worlds with Tom Cruise, you see that people are kind of unsure how to engage with the alien life form, and so they kind of pursue it with some kind of guarded sense of self-security, but once the alien life form starts to vaporize people and destroy property, then people have an understanding about what that life form is really all about. And it's about destruction and mayhem, and it is not coming in peace. So people are responding in kind. Okay, so the way that this is described in the article, if you want to look at whether we're talking about states or aliens, you've got two different parties, right? So you've got state A and state B. And both of these have their own identities. And then both of them will assess the situation according to their prior experience and their knowledge. And then they will react based on these interpretations. And this will create a kind of intersubjective understanding and expectations that are created by both of these actors. So we have to think about the identities, the stimulus that requires some kind of action, whether it's E.T. just popping his head up and screaming, or whether it's vaporizing humans as they're running around on the streets. Both parties assessing the situation, whether it's these are conquerable humans or these are individuals who are fearful of alternative life forms, and then they have to act in some way, whether it's running away or something like that. So states operate in very much the same way. They have their own identities, which are comprised of a complex array of historical information, current leadership, culture, all these different kinds of factors. And then they have, they're greeted by some kind of stimulus, like say, a leader of another country says that it is no longer going to accept the presence of that country's military on a base within their country. So say Japan wanted to kick out all of the US servicemen and women. Well, based on the history that the United States has with Japan, it would have to assess the situation, whether this is considered to be an aggressive act or whether there's more to the story before they take any kind of concerted action. They have to think about what are the ramifications, how is this going to disrupt the long-term relationship of the United States and Japan, and then ultimately both of them have to act in some way, and the results of those actions will form a kind of new understanding about the evolving relationship between those two countries. So that's kind of how it works in the international system. So a final example of this can be seen in, again, the most important international norm, and that is sovereignty. So how do practices of sovereignty transform understandings of security and power? And Wendt gives a few responses to this particular question. First, he says states will come to define their security in terms of preserving their property rights over particular territories. Second, as states begin to internalize sovereignty norms, they will be more respectful toward the territorial rights of others. And as states recognize that sovereignty depends on the recognition by other states, they can rely more on norms and less on military power to provide security. So it's this process through which norms kind of emerge, interpretations are made, the understandings of those norms are internalized within the state itself, and then eventually it moves further and further away from needing to use any kind of military force because the norm becomes the expectation, and you don't need to have guns pointed at the other country in order for that country to understand what your intentions are, or to remove those guns to know that you don't have negative intentions. So this kind of process that Wendt talks about describes the role that norms may play in diffusing negative relationships, forming more concrete intersubjective understandings about the realities where sovereignty or other international norms are concerned.